colleague Delbert Boone and a host of others. Before we get to our speakers, for typical difficulties of doing these Zoom things, Mike Guidry, our section chair, will hopefully be joining us in a minute for an official welcome from the section. But we have some other upcoming events just want to let you know about before we get to our features topic tonight. On March 10th, we're going to have a webinar on electrification trends in heavy-duty trucks. So hardcore engineering, that'll be from folks at ACT Expo, which is the big heavy-duty truck conference in Long Beach each May. March 15th through the 17th, SAE International will be having an aerospace conference called Aerotech in Pasadena. And April, we get very, very busy. April 10th, 8th through the 10th, we have 2 concurrent events. SAE Aero Design Collegiate Design Competition will take place in Van Nuys. So those of you on the aerospace side, if you're looking to recruit some great talent, that's a great place to go. There'll be dozens of schools from around the country and a few international entries there. It's also the annual Acura Grand Prix of Long Beach, and we hope to have an SAE, Formula SAE student and Baja display there at the Grand Prix. On Saturday, the 9th at the Grand Prix, we'll be partnering with Stand 21 on their annual Safety Foundation seminar. So that'll be a good one. And then we're working with our friends over at SEMA. We're going to have a special event for students at the SEMA Garage on April 23rd. Since there's not a Formula SAE or Baja SAE competition in California this year, we wanted to help the students get kind of set before competition, giving them some critical feedback on their designs and their presentations, and inviting some of the local companies who are actively hiring a chance to meet the students. So we've listed here some of the websites where you can find out more about our calendar of events. If there's anyone who's an SAE member and says, hey, you know, I'm not getting the email, it means one of 2 things. You either haven't paid your dues or you forgot to opt in for emails. SAE, for those of you who don't know, has adopted the European standard on email deliveries. And it's not an opt-out, it's an opt-in. And so even if you paid your $120 a year to be a member, if you didn't check the box, we're not legally allowed to send you any emails. So please make sure you do that. So did we get Mike Guidry on? If not, I am going to just jump in. We'll let Mike say a few words at the end. But for tonight, we've got a special program. While engineers, this is not a technical presentation tonight, but we know that a lot of automotive engineers like motorsports and like motorsports history. And there's a lot of fascinating stories out there. And for those of us who still collect books, there's a lot of great reading material out there. So we kind of pulled together 3 ones that are not related in any way, but they're all just fascinating topics. Randy Cannon is going to talk about the history of the Caesars Palace Grand Prix, which, when you get the book, extends far beyond Las Vegas. That was the most fascinating thing for me on that one. Faster, Neal Bascomb has basically pre-World War II intrigue, a Jewish race driver racing against Hitler's best. Fascinating story with some American connections in that. And Neal comes from a journalistic background that had no background in motorsports. So I think he found things that most car people probably would have missed. And then my longtime friend, Sylvia Wilkinson, is she's now delving into her archive and bringing some of the books back that have been long since out of print. Where's my copy? Here, I've got her Dirt Tracks to Glory. If you try to buy that now, you can find it, but it'll cost you probably $150 or $200 on the used market. Sylvia has updated the book with some new stories. And so that'll be available in a couple of months. So without any further ado, Neal, I will stop my screen share. And if you'd like to kind of walk us through yours,
Sure.
We'll get started that way.
Well, thank you, Dean. And it's nice to be here with everybody, Randy and Sylvia. I'll try to keep this relatively short here so that the 3 of us can have a conversation and answer questions from the participants. I just want to tell you briefly about Faster and how I came to write this book. I've written about all kinds of different subjects, from hunting Nazis in Argentina to Russian mutinies to breaking the 4-minute mile. And I love stories about underdogs. And this story came to me through a friend at the Wall Street Journal who just happened to sort of pass along this rather amazing story about the invasion of Paris. And when the Gestapo went in, there was a few individuals out there in the Germans who were looking for these Ford Delahaye 145 race cars. And in advance of the German invasion in 1940, the owner, the Delahaye company, as well as Lucy Schell, had those cars hidden, disassembled in some cases, hidden away in others, and they were never found, never seized by the Nazis who were looking to capture them. What was taken was the Gestapo went to the Automobile Club in France. They asked for all the records related to the victory in 1938 of the Delahaye and any other French victories, had those files taken away, and they've never been seen since. And that sort of story was the impetus behind me trying to figure out what was it about these cars, what was it about Lucy Schell and the Delahaye company that made these cars so important, and to essentially have history be erased. And that led me, of course, to René Dreyfus. René was a French Grand Prix driver, one of the top Grand Prix drivers of the early 1930s. One person said, journalists described him as having a stare of searing intensity and undying affection that lets you know without a doubt that René was put on this earth to drive cars fast. René, like I said, was driving for the top teams until really the nationalism and fascism overcame Europe in the mid-1930s. He rather quickly found himself banned from the best teams and from the best cars because of his Jewish heritage. And he's essentially out of the Grand Prix at a certain point by 1935. And in walks to help him come back is this individual named Lucy Schell, who was probably one of the most favorite people I've ever researched over the course of, I think, something like 10 books now. She was just an absolute dynamo, one of the early female race car drivers. She was a particularly good rally driver, one of the best Americans in the Monte Carlo rally. She was born very rich. She was a nurse in World War I. She just despised the Germans. And by the 30s, when the Germans began introducing their Silver Arrow race cars and begin dominating the scene with their very fast engines, very nimble Silver Arrow cars, they basically are sweeping the Grand Prix. Their sort of lead champion was Rudy Caracciola, who you see here, who was kind of the propaganda king of the Nazis in racing. And racing into the Grand Prix was probably the most popular sport in Europe at the time. So this was propaganda for the Germans, as well as a number of other things. And Lucy wanted to beat the Germans at their own game. And so she had a Delahaye. She went to this Delahaye automobile company, employed them to build her a brand new Grand Prix car. She hired René Dreyfus to be her lead driver. And the story of Faster is really a story of building that car, of assembling that team with René at the very top of it, and then going on and battling the Germans at the beginning of the 1938 Grand Prix. It's a story about these incredible heroes and their ultimate victory over the Germans. And that's a pretty good summation. I'll sort of leave it there, so give other people time. And then I'd love to answer questions and begin the conversation. Thank you.
Hey, Randy, you want to pull up your screen share?
Thank you, Neal.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Randy Cannon. I'm going to introduce my new book, Caesar's Palace Grand Prix, Las Vegas, Organized Crime and the Pinnacle of Motorsport. Caesar's Palace Grand Prix really flows from my first book, Stardust International Raceway, Motorsports Meets the Mob in Vegas, and they did. Stardust was owned by Mo Dalitz, a pretty well-known member of the Cleveland Syndicate, racketeer, who moved to Las Vegas and got deep into resort property development. And Stardust was published in 18. In 19, I was wondering kind of what might come next. And Niki Lauda passed away in May of 19, and the light bulb went off. Oh yeah, Niki raced at the 1982 Caesar's Palace Grand Prix. And so I wanted to start digging in and see if there might be a similar sort of story that I could craft around the Caesar's Palace Grand Prix, all 4 years of it. I started with the program, not a bad place to start for an event named book, and wanted to see what kind of tools I might have to work with on the masthead here. First up, Clifford Pearlman. I remember him from living in Las Vegas in the 70s and 80s, chairman of the board. Had alleged organized crime connections at the time and was mentioned on the infamous Abscam recordings, for those of you who remember the congressional influence peddling probe of that time period. Harry Wald, interesting fellow. He was an original 1966 gambling licensee and investor, at least on paper, and he was the CEO of the resort at the time. Bill Weinberger, got to know Bill fairly well. He's still around. He was the VP of casino marketing, essentially the president of the Grand Prix event. He was the son of an original investor and was very forthcoming with that side of the resort. A lot more interest in this masthead. Chris Pook, Long Beach Grand Prix Association. I was fascinated as to how Chris Pook came to be so deeply embedded in the Caesars Palace Grand Prix, listed here as Grand Prix consultant. A few other people from the Long Beach Grand Prix are on the masthead here. And this one, Dr. Jeffrey McDonald, the convicted fatal vision murderer, for those of you who remember the case. He's listed as the medical consultant, looking after the health and safety of the great Formula One drivers of the world, while his murder conviction is on appeal to the US Supreme Court. I knew that was going in the book. I wanted to see what the podium looked like. Alan Jones, winner for Williams, Alain Prost, second for Renault. Bruno Giacomelli, third for Alfa Romeo, his only Formula One podium ever. And there, sure enough, there's Cliff and Harry in their shiny silver event jackets. So I knew I had a podium to ride around. Structurally, I wanted to see what that looked like. I knew I had plenty of Las Vegas, plenty of organized crime connections, and Formula One, the pinnacle of motorsport. And right there is the sweet spot in the center is where I was going to write the story. I needed some points of origin. For the Caesars Palace Grand Prix to exist, we had to have Formula One in America. I started with the American Grand Prix at Watkins Glen in 1948. That was the first event on the city streets of Watkins Glen.
Hey, Randy?
Yes.
Not to interrupt, but if you're trying to share your screen, we're not seeing it.
I'm so sorry. I show it shared on mine.
Hate to interrupt, but just.
Thank you for interrupting. Let me try this differently. Gosh darn it.
Luckily, we're among friends, so.
Oh my head.
Now it looks like it's going to come up. It says Randy Cannon. There we go.
Okay.
We got time. Go back.
It looks. I'm so sorry. It showed I was sharing and
right now it's showing. You might want to start the slideshow. So right now it shows you as the.
Okay. This is the
yeah.
Option. Is it sharing now?
Yeah. Now we got it.
Okay. The full slide?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not showing the share bar around my monitor here. Okay, picking up where I was. Well, there's that magic graphic in the sweet spot in the center. The 1948 Watkins Glen Grand Prix, called the American Grand Prix at the time. The other thread that was essential to Caesars Palace was organized crime. And I started with the post-war existence of Meyer Lansky, generally number 3 in the organized crime syndicate behind Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese. I really like this quote about him. It really informs Caesars Palace. A gambling empire extending to every casino in the free world. Bernie Ecclestone, take note. I want to follow the thread of Formula One all the way through to America to Caesars Palace. 1959, this is in the book. The first USGP at Sebring, Bruce McLaren, the winner. The 1960 US Grand Prix at Riverside. Formula One at the time was back and forth. It did not have a home. This one was won by Sterling Moss. The 1961, the first US Grand Prix at Watkins Glen, won by Innes, Ireland. And it launched me on a 20-year study of the USGP at Watkins Glen, from the first here all the way to the last in 1980, and ultimately the bankruptcy of the facility. This is Mario Andretti on the starting grid in his last ever start for Lotus before he jumped to Alfa Romeo. I dug deep into Caesars Palace. From the FBI reports, here we're talking about made members of the mafia investing, acquiring points in Caesars Palace. To the groundbreaking, that's Harry Wald at the groundbreaking, from groundbreaking to podium. The grand opening with Jimmy Hoffa in attendance if you need him. Picture postcard views of the period Las Vegas Valley. That's the Caesars property just beyond the dune sign there. Beautiful view of the fountains from chapter 4. I knew I had to go through Long Beach, not just for the history of Formula One and how it got to Caesars, but also Chris Pook. I studied Chris's existence in the Long Beach Grand Prix from his first landing in roughly 72, 73 in SoCal. This quote about him was from Long Beach, from dynamic and brilliant to con man and thief. Chris rubbed a lot of people positively and negatively. I did a deep study of the Long Beach Grand Prix to understand how it touched Caesar's Palace, and there were a lot of interesting connections in Long Beach. Here's Mario Andretti in 1975. Mario Andretti winning in 77. This was the Netflix Drive to Survive effect of 45 years ago. Mario winning on home soil was huge. And I studied Long Beach all the way through to its transition from Formula One to IndyCar, just as Caesar's Palace transitioned from Formula One to IndyCar. I did a deep dive on the Grand Prix proper. I wanted to really understand what made this Grand Prix come together at Caesar's Palace. The groundbreaking, Bill Weinberger, the tall gentleman right there in the center, terrific interviews for the book. Construction was quite an undertaking in the summer of '81. Planning, preparations, the parties, Leroy Neiman and actress Morgan Fairchild. And this photo stopped me dead in my tracks. The Caesars Pocono Resorts, happy little honeymoon haven in the Poconos of Pennsylvania. Caesars branded property was owned by the alleged #2 in the National Organized Crime Syndicate, Alvin Malnick, also the alleged protege of Meyer Lansky. It really informed the complexities behind the scenes of the Caesars Palace Grand Prix. I also wanted to do a faithful reporting of all 4 Grand Prix events. Alan Jones, winner in '81. Michele Alboreto, winner for Tyrrell in '82. In '83, we transitioned to kart IndyCar. Mario Andretti won the event. He's roughly 4th in that front straight image. 1984, won by Tom Sneva. Mario 2nd, his second IndyCar championship. Tom Sneva's in the white car in the back center. In the last chapter, I transitioned from the final Caesars Palace Grand Prix to the cancellation of the event, what was going on behind the scenes. And I also pondered the many, many efforts to return Formula One to the proximity of the Strip. This 1996 USGP Las Vegas obviously didn't happen. But I pondered it all the way through to about 2017, probably about 8 to 10 efforts to return Formula One to Las Vegas. Was it going to look like this, or might it look something more like this? It's a fascinating study in and of itself. A few places the book is available for those who might be intrigued. Available from the publisher, McFarlandBooks.com. Always in stock at Auto Books, Aero Books, and Burbank. And you can search for it at online booksellers pretty much around the globe. A few people have picked up the book and written some nice things about it. And nice little sticker there on the left. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate your interest in the book. And I think that's about it for me, Neal. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. We'll get to you when we get to the Q&A again. So let's stop the screen share on that. And now we can go to Sylvia. TJ, yeah, there we go. Sylvia, you're up. Sylvia, tell us a little bit about what brought you to bring Dirt Tracks to Glory back into print.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Sylvia.
Oh, okay. Well, I wanted to correct a lot of the mistakes. No, there were mistakes in the picture captions. And also, there were so many more pictures available. I wrote the book in 1981, published it in '83. And back then, I had to just sort of beg for pictures. Bill France gave me quite a few. And Humpy Wheeler gave me a lot. And people would let me borrow their pictures, but they were quite afraid to let go of them. But what I did was, I think I wrote a parallel history. One was intentional. That was the one about stock car racing. And the other one was unintentional, and that was about women in racing. My publisher, Algonquin Books of Chapel Hill, they wanted me to do this book, but they had absolutely no knowledge of how hostile the stock car people were towards women at that time. And I had to try to fill them in, but it never sank in. So I said, okay, I'll go ahead and do it. But in the 1960s, mid 1960s, I had an experience with Banjo Matthews, who was one of the major stock car builders. I was sent to his shop to pick up some fuel for a friend. And I walked in the door and I heard this voice, "Get that woman out of here. We got a race car going." So that was kind of my introduction to stock car racing. And I went outside, waited for my gas, paid my bill, and left. And then sometime not long after that, I was at a race at Daytona, where we had a twin bill with the stock car guys. They were running during the day and we were running the Paul Revere race at night. And I was working for a team, helping some friends out. And I was on the ground, sitting on the ground, cleaning some wheels. And all of a sudden, someone picked me up by the elbows and threw me out in the parking lot. And they also threw Pat Maloney, female driver, they threw her out too. So that was kind of the beginning for me with stock car racing. So when they sent me off to do this book, I had a little bit of anxiety about meeting up with these people again. So I can briefly tell you about my experience with Banjo. This was in the early 1980s. He immediately insulted me. He said, "You know, nobody's going to read this and nobody really cares what you've got to say about us." Okay. So he went on and he talked for about 3 hours. And during that time, he said, "Well, you know, if a guy's got a woman working on a team, he's never going to get anywhere. Because if he's going to get somewhere, he'd get the people together who knew what they were doing." So this went on. And finally, I ran out of tape. And he said, "Well, you want to go get some coffee? And I've got a friend who really makes a wonderful apple pie. And I'd like to take you by there and we'll get you a slice of apple pie and a cup of coffee." And I said, "Oh, okay, Banjo." So we went to this place. We walked in the door. And I heard a voice booming out, similar to Banjo, when I walked into his shop. And she said, "I made your pie yesterday. You didn't come in here and get it. And it's cold." And then he said, "Well, she makes a real nice pie. It'll be good a day old." So we sat down. She threw the pie on the table in front of us and we ate the pie. And we got ready to leave. And Banjo said, "Come get your money." And she said, "Put your own money in the damn cash register." So I watched Banjo Matthews go behind the counter, put his money in the cash register. And I kind of felt like that was a funny kind of triumph. So that was my first introduction to the stock car guys. But now I don't have to tell you, there are women everywhere and they get to do the good jobs. They get to go down in the pits and interview the drivers and the crew guys. And the men sit up in the booth with miserable in coats and ties. But now the other side of my history was the stock car guys. And this was the intended thing. And I decided to just let everybody talk. I used a tape recorder for the first time in my life. And I used their tapes and I kind of put them all together in what I thought was a sort of a history of the sport. And I realized while I was doing this that I'd been involved in sports car racing, and these people, their backgrounds were extremely poverty stricken. Like Bobby Isaac, who became a great champion. Humpy Wheeler told me, you know, he grew up in a Milltown third grade education. Even Bill France Sr. at one time had a very modest life. When he first came to Daytona, he had a wife and a baby, $25 cash and $75 in the bank and a humpmobile. And 1934. And of course, he became the czar of NASCAR. Another guy I got to talk to was a wonderful guy named Tim Flock, and he was one of the Flock family. And he had brothers, Fonnie and Bob, who were racers. And he also had a sister, Ethel, who was a very good driver. They named her after high test gasoline, Ethel. And then he had another sister named Rio, named after the Rio Speedwagon, and she was a wing walker. She would hang by her heels on the wing of an airplane. And when they were little kids, there were 9 of them, the Flock family. Daddy died. He was a daredevil and he died. So here was Mama with 9 little kids, no money, worked $9 a week in a mill. So they went to work for their uncle in Atlanta, who was a bootlegger. So that was how Tim Flock got into racing, through the bootleg side. Bill France would not talk about that side of it. And I just let Bill France talk about what he wanted to talk about, and I let Tim talk about what he wanted to talk about. But I feel like I got the picture of both sides. But these people are definitely, like, well, Neal would understand this, they're not the kid glove people. They're more the Big Mac work glove people, that even though they started in just poor mill towns, bootleggers, and they ended up being, in a very few years, many of them multimillionaires. So that's my story.
Well, and for those of you who don't know, Sylvia is also a very respected timing and scoring guru from the early days, but pre-computers, where you would time the entire field with one stopwatch, correct?
I was at that Caesar's Palace race timing. Yeah, and I remember having to walk through the Caesar's Palace area in my little uniform with the patches all over me, and how embarrassed I was with all these beautifully clad women. And I'm going out to my timing stand, and then during the event, Linda Thompson, I don't know if you remember her, but Linda Thompson was the Hee Haw girl, former girlfriend of Elvis Presley and Bruce Jenner, and she's a wonderful character. And she's sat in the timing stand with me at Caesar's Palace. I remember more about that than I do about the race, because she was so funny. But I did a lot of timing, and I went to Caesar's Palace a number of times, and most of the time they complained an awful lot about the track, how much it hurt their necks, because all the turns were the same.
Well, let's start going a little around, all three of you. Let's kind of talk about how you did your research and what were the biggest challenges. I mean, Neal, virtually no one you wanted to talk to would have been alive. So, where were the archives you were digging into? What were the biggest challenges?
Yeah, I mean, that was obviously the initial challenge, because obviously these events happened 90 years ago. So I didn't have the opportunity to interview people. And, initially I sort of hit a wall when I earlier got so excited about this project and so excited about the story and the narrative, and then just started running into walls and walls and walls in terms of the research. And, I'd never written about cars before. I'd never researched automotive history. And, it was very different than even tracking down spies in the Mossad. I mean, at least you can find archives in various places. But in the automobile world, and I'm sure Sylvia and Randy can commiserate with me, is that the collections tend to be scattered all over the place. And they're in private collections, and people who amass historical documents over a period of 20, 30 years and then are reluctant to give you a glance. But fortunately, Evelyn Dreyfus, Renee's niece, after several letters to her, sent me this huge volume of material, newspaper articles, letters, even the speeches at his funeral for her uncle. And really started, the ball rolling down the hill, to mix my metaphors. And I found myself going to those private collections. Anyone from Peter Mullen, who owns several of the Delahaye's, he has, photograph albums from Lucy Shell's team, Ecurie Blue, to Sam Mann, who also owns a Delahaye 145. He's collected a number of documents. And then I spent a lot of time in Europe. A lot of time combing through French and Italian and German newspapers. I have to say, one of the most delicious things in researching this book was reading the writings of these incredible journalists back then. Some of the best writers were writing about motorsports, and the descriptions they gave really helped me bring this story to life. And I owe a huge debt to them.
Was that, you had spent a few years yourself as a journalist in Europe. Did that kind of help you figure out where to find these things?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, most of my books tend to be international stories. So I've developed a bit of a system and contacts in Europe. And also I spent, as you mentioned, a few years in Europe. My German's pretty good. My French is decent. And my wife is Italian. So I had some support. And whenever things got really sticky, my father-in-law, who was born in, outside of Lucca, helped things a great deal. So, again, Randy and Sylvia can back me up here. A book is never written just by one person. It's a team effort, and I just a little bit of the conductor at a certain point.
Well, Randy, what about your research? I mean, many of the people are alive, but if you're talking organized crime, that's probably, they may not want to talk to you. How intimidating was that to look into potential criminals that you're writing about?
It took me a long time to find Bill Weinberger, for example, son of an original investor in Caesar's Palace. Very nice gentleman. He was careful about what he wanted to share with me, but at the same time, he kind of pulled the curtain open and let me see what Caesar's Palace was really like. And he helped me understand the deals between Clifford Pearlman and Alvin Malnick, the alleged number 2 in the syndicate behind Meyer Lansky, or the protege to Meyer Lansky. But it was definitely white knuckle. I never knew what questions I could freely ask Bill, and if I was ever going to upset him to the point he wanted to just break me off. Put organized crime into anything, and it can become extremely sensitive. But FBI files are free, and they're not easy to research, but they're out there. And as is Department of Justice and Securities and Exchange Commission, and on and on and on. And I leveraged everything I could find in that regard. Like Neal, and as Sylvia described, photos can be tough to come by, and car books kind of require that there be photos in them, and to photo illustrate a 70-year storyline involving automobiles. It was an extreme challenge. I will tell you though, writing about Chris Pook and Roger Penske was probably more stressful than writing about organized crime subjects. They both kind of rattled me a little bit. What I could reasonably say without involving authorities and lawyers. So I was very careful in that regard.
Well, it sounds like, Sylvia, sometimes they were not easy to approach the first time, but once they said no, but then would talk to you for 3 hours. So what were some of your most interesting, interviews and research?
Well, to me, one of the really interesting things was how much people talked about the people who were no longer with us. I felt like I really got to know Fireball Roberts, Little Joe Weatherly, Curtis Turner, Bobby Isaac, because once they were gone, people made them into kind of almost, really, really legendary figures. And the other thing that they talked about a lot relating to those guys is how their deaths, the death of Little Joe Weatherly and Fireball Roberts, really changed the sport because they were beloved by their fans at the time. They really loved them. Little Joe was a real clown. He got out and marched with the majorettes before a race in Bermuda shorts, and Fireball was deeply loved by everyone. And of course, Little Joe died at Riverside when his head went out the window and hit the wall because the cars were going not in the direction they were used to going. So the driver's side was on the wall side. So that led to the window net being put in cars. And of course, Fireball's horrible death was because he didn't have on a proper fire suit and also didn't have a fuel cell in the car. And they just finally said, we've got to do something about this or we're going to lose the greatest people in our sport. So people talked a lot about that. They talked about how Fireball was starting to be humiliated by his younger co-driver, Fred Lorenzen, how he was thinking about retiring. And the other person they talked about a lot, this was Dan Gurney talked about, was Curtis Turner. And Dan said Curtis passed him at Riverside after several nights of drinking, bloodshot eyes with his wingtip shoes still on. And he said there was no way Curtis was going to make it through that turn. Absolutely no way. And he just watched him crash and flip. And he was one of the greatest of all time. But the way Curtis passed away was pretty ironic. And that was in an airplane when he was probably back in the back fixing himself a drink. And he had some guy in the pilot's seat who didn't even know how to fly. And the plane went into the side of a mountain. But then on the other hand, I talked to Richard Howard, who loved to fly with Curtis. He talked about, and knowing Curtis had died that way, but he talked a lot about flying with Curtis and landing once in a churchyard and having all the people come out and Curtis, backing out into the street, taking off on a street, barely clearing the telephone wires. So the people who were no longer with us, I think sometimes I got a better picture of them. And the other thing I had a problem with were people like Lee Petty, who wouldn't talk to me at all. But I talked to his secretary and she says, some days he won't even talk to Richard. So I figured, okay, I shouldn't feel insulted by that. But anyway, I felt like some of the legends, I wanted to give them as much as I could in a true picture. So I talked to a lot of different people, and Humpy Wheeler was just my savior there because he introduced me to everybody. He's a terrific guy.
Well, if Humpy says that you should talk to him, they'll talk to you.
You should talk to them,
Yeah.
and they'll talk to you. Right.
How about who was probably, is there one person in particular that you were really happy to finally bring out of the shadows? Their story that might not have been told if it wasn't for some of the interviews you captured?
Well, Wendell Scott had a major motion picture made about him, Grease Lightning, but I really felt like the things he said to me didn't come out in that movie. And I felt like it was a very important interview. I rode around a pickup truck with him with a little fan on the dashboard because he didn't have an air conditioner and he wanted me to be comfortable. And he just opened up to me. And I really felt like that was one of the better parts of the book. And another one was Linda Vaughn. I'm really fond of Linda. I tell everybody, every woman should walk beside Linda Vaughn so you can just see what jackasses men are. I mean, you walk through the pits beside her and they drop their tools, they drool down their chin. And it's just an amazing thing. And she's so friendly and everybody loves her. And she's really a wonderful person. And I love talking to her. She was a wonderful interview.
Yeah, she's also got the most incredible memory. She remembers everything.
Everything.
So let's see what else we want to cover here. We'll start going to some of the questions from people posed. I guess the biggest surprise on Randy's book was the fact that how much of the book was not Las Vegas centered. That all this was at all the other tracks too, Riverside and Long Beach and Watkins Glen. I think that was for me a big surprise. How much of a surprise was that for you?
Extremely so. I had no idea. I knew I had to start the book somewhere, and I assumed that they would be straight line parallel paths to Caesar's Palace. But at Watkins Glen, there were odd connections, generally in favor of law enforcement. The safety director for Watkins Glen Grand Prix Corporation, Charles Kress, had investigated the host of the infamous 1957 Appleton organized crime conference right up the road from Watkins Glen. When I spoke to the International Motor Racing Research Center, one of their historians there remembered Charles Kress, and so we were able to flesh that out a little bit. At Riverside, vaunted Riverside International Raceway, the historic track, but in the second ownership group, Roy Jean Lewis, the Hollywood Mercedes-Benz dealer, got involved in a Nevada gambling property that involved Teamster loans and 2 or 3 different hustles, and got involved in Teamster loans in Southern California that ultimately sent him to prison. Really interesting. Yet at the same time, his Nevada gambling property had connections to one of the originators of Caesar's Palace. I would have never imagined that. And at Long Beach, Chris Pook was contentious and controversial in his own right. The Long Beach Grand Prix had all kinds of charges and accusations around it, and whether or not Long Beach City Council any of them were on the up and up. But at the same time, the Federal Organized Crime Task Force was on the ground in Long Beach, and one of the names in their dossier was also one of the originators of Caesar's Palace, and they also looked in on the contracts involving the Long Beach Grand Prix while they were camped out. So there was just no shortage of intrigue as I plotted what I thought was going to be 2 distinct threads. I had no idea they were going to collide all the way down the path to Caesar's Palace.
Interesting. Neil, a question that popped up was about, you got a chance to drive one of these cars, correct?
I did. Yes, the Peter Mullen car, the Delahaye 145. I think I have if you'll spare me a moment, I think I have a picture of it here. There I am in all my glory. It was absolutely horrifying to drive and be a passenger in. It's the tires were very thin. The engine sounded like a boat. I felt like I was flying, going about 60 miles an hour. So I can't imagine what Renee and these various other drivers experienced, when they were doing 120 miles an hour in these things. And I just, sort of harkening back to what Sylvia was talking about, and the sort of lack of safety measures for these drivers in stock car racing. They were battling the same things in the Grand Prix in the early 1930s when the sort of escalation speed really, really took off. They weren't wearing helmets. They weren't wearing harnesses. Every weekend they would, you would have someone dying. Sometimes several individuals were dying. And, one of the through lines of Faster in the book is this underlying narrative about these drivers facing death. And, I think Renee probably said it best where, the quote is, "I was intimately acquainted with death." And he faced it on every weekend. Every time he got in the car, he faced it with his friends, his loved ones. And it was just something that almost was a companion in the seat next to them. As you can see, it was, as you saw, they were an extra seat in these cars. So, and it's just a remarkable period in the Grand Prix. And it harkens back to, again, what's happening to, in stock car.
Thank you. Question here for Sylvia. This was from Randy Priest. Should the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum race become a dirt track race and remain on the annual schedule? Did you watch the clash there the other week?
Yeah. Yeah. And you're asking me if it should remain?
Should it remain, or it should be a dirt track?
Asking. I think it would probably be better as a dirt track, but it was certainly well attended.
I got a question here. How hard was it to convince major race sanctioning bodies that Las Vegas racetracks and race promoters were the real deal?
I guess that one's for me.
Yeah.
It was the backstory of the sanctioning, the approval and the sanctioning. Basically, it was a story within many, many, many stories. There was just so much reluctance to transition from the time-honored Watkins Glen circuit to anything as sullied as Caesar's Palace, let alone to the nature of what the Caesar's Palace circuit might be. And even up to the event itself, it was extremely contentious. Nobody knew what to make of it. Bernie Ecclestone was certainly on board. He loved everything about Las Vegas. He still comes to Vegas to gamble away and enjoy his friends in high places. I don't think the SCCA really knew what to do with it, nor the FIA, nor the Sporting Arm FISA. It was an absolute aberration, at least in the sporting consciousness of the time. Little off track, but was certainly on board. Pardon me? He loved everything about Las Vegas. He still comes to Vegas. Had a little feedback there, Dean. Don't know what happened.
I don't know what that was.
I'm a phantom. I lost my train of thought. I apologize. I'll see if I can pick it up later.
Well, I'll follow up with another question for you. This one, I'm not sure if she's asking this serious or in jest. Randy, as you researched old crime motorsports connections, did you get the feeling that there are still criminal elements in racing, or do you think it's all cleaned up now?
No, I just think it's under cloak of the boardroom. You couldn't convince me otherwise. Someone had a similar question in the chat, And I think organized crime exists everywhere that the global 1% want to save on their taxes.
So, Sylvia, since you were there with teams for those years, did anyone want to go back to Las Vegas, or are they glad that they didn't have to go back?
No, I think they were pretty glad they didn't have to go back, except for John Paul Jr. I mean, he never complained about anything. He loved to drive so much. He said, well, the track's a little flat. And he said, the turns a little bit too much alike, but it was still fun to drive.
Actually, that's not, I should grab it off my,
you know?
Another one of Sylvia's books is you completed a book on John Paul Jr. You don't by chance have one handy, do you?
I'll send Molly for it.
Okay, we should put it up. Actually, we'll switch over. Neal, with your book right now. Oh, there it is. Sylvia, this is called 50/50. Why don't you give a little plug for that book as well, because that one was near and dear to your heart and the cause and where the money's going.
Yeah, John Paul Jr. asked me to tell his story about getting Huntington's disease, which was a 50/50 hereditary thing. And he came out getting it, as did his sister, his mother, his grandmother, his aunt, and they all perished. And John lived until December of last year. And I wrote his story for him, and all the money from the sale of the book goes to the Huntington's Foundation to hopefully someday stop this terrible disease. He went from being a completely healthy guy in his late 30s to just a miserable person for the last years of his life. But UCLA worked a lot with him, and he lived 10 years longer than anyone in his family had lived. But he's somebody I was quite fond of, a great guy.
One thing that all of your books have a little bit in common, I think, is the fact that they have story elements that appeal to non-race fans. And I think whether you loved it or hate it, Ford v. Ferrari proved that racing movies could appeal to a wider audience if it's well done. So, Neal, any movie studios approached you about telling the Faster story?
They have. I mean, when I originally sold it to my publisher, it was optioned for film. It went through I've had several drafts of screenplays, but it's sort of faltered a little bit over the past 6 months, and it may resuscitate, it may not. I'm happy to have the book. I mean, I always write these things, and I think the story and the narrative speaks for itself with Renee and Lucy. And if Hollywood comes knocking again, that would be great. I wouldn't shy away from that. But for now, it's just the book.
Well, I mean, it took Garth Stein 10 years, or he sold the movie rights, and it took Patrick Dempsey 10 years to bring it to the screen. So, Randy, I mean, obviously, crime is a great thing for movies. So, have they approached you yet? Are we going to see Caesar's Palace Grand Prix, the movie?
I'm like Neal in that regard. I'll believe it when I see it, I guess. There have been a couple of producers / screenwriters who have inquired about optioning it, but that's as far as it's gotten. But I think it's a gimme for a Martin Scorsese effort.
Sylvia, I mean, several of your books, I think, have been potential for movies. And for those of you who don't know, besides Sylvia's background writing automotive topics, correct me if I get this wrong, your original category was young Southern woman novelist, correct, Sylvia?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Then you decided to play with cars.
Right. Well, that was what I did for the fun of it, and the writing was my work. And somehow they managed to merge. Yeah. Yeah.
So like the 50/50 book is potential for a movie on that one?
Yeah, there is. There's a potential documentary. I'm talking to some folks about that now. But we'll wait and see what happens. But we had a potential movie for The Saint of Steel Carrot, and we pretty much fell out of our chairs laughing at the screenplay they came up with. It was so awful. It was absolutely awful. But so when you let go of something like that, as I'm sure Neal found out, something happens to your story.
That's definitely the case.
And of course, we got John Dinkle. Looks like here with bad puns. A movie about the Las Vegas race would be a real gamble. Oh, bad John Dinkle. Bad John Dinkle.
The lowest form of humor.
Yeah, the punster. Actually, let me ask, do each of you have questions for the other? I mean, now that we've had a little bit of a discussion, Neal, anything that pops to mind about Randy or Sylvia's books, or vice versa? These are meant to just be kind of fun promotional opportunities, and we joke that SAE members are used to spending $100 or $200 for a technical book. So your books are all bargains. They should just go out and buy them at full retail. So.
Yeah, well, Sylvia, I guess I'd ask, it's probably an impossible question to answer, but your sort of favorite anecdote from or favorite interview that you had over the course of writing the book.
What was my favorite?
Yeah.
Gee, hard to say. I really, actually, he's not a Southern boy, but I really love talking to Dan Gurney. He just seemed so relaxed, and he gave me a lot of insight into how an outsider who came in, how he felt, and how Junior Johnson would give him a kind of a look, and how Darrell Waltrip never would talk to him and didn't even acknowledge he was there. It was really interesting to see, because he was already, of course, extremely famous, and he totally dominated except for one race, the Riverside stock car race. But I loved my interview with him. That was one of my favorites.
Randy, any questions for the others?
Neal and Sylvia, I'm both fascinated by your subjects. I love deep American histories. Sylvia, the anecdotes you've shared they're priceless. And Neal, I started both Stardust and Caesars in the immediate post World War II period, and I'm just absolutely fascinated by your telling of this motorsport story that actually predates World War II. There wouldn't be many such motorsport stories, and you've put together just an absolutely terrific one.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sylvia, anything about the other two books? I think you've read faster, right?
Mm-hmm. What do you want me to? What do you want me to
do?
Just,
if you had any questions, or here again, it's a discussion.
I'd like to hear a critique, Sylvia.
Oh no, I don't do that. I don't do that to my fellow writers. I'm not a critiquer, not at all. Because I might need you to put a blurb on the back of a book someday. I gotta be nice.
Yeah, you gotta be nice. It's a small community.
Well, Neal's modest, he's got the book behind him, but where's your Dean Bachelor Award?
Well, I've just moved in to my new house, so I haven't quite unpacked everything, but it will be somewhere on these shelves here.
So Faster, for those of you who don't know, won the Dean Bachelor Award for best literary work of the year in all categories. You won Book of the Year as well as the Dean Bachelor Award. So that was high praise for particularly a lot of the judges probably never heard of you because you'd never written a car book before. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, they had. I'd done nothing to make them mad at me, so that I was the shoe-in.
So we got any more questions in the chat or the Q&A section that we'd like to address? Neal, TJ, am I missing anything?
There's a question here about Renee and LeChanticleer. The only thing I would say about LeChanticleer is it was the second great part about Renee's life. His memoir was called My Two Lives for a reason. He had this tremendous life as a race car driver, and then equally long life as a restaurateur. And he was beloved in New York, and it was sort of epicenter of eating and racing in New York for a long period of time. And I think it's just, more than anything, it's just testament to what an incredible person Renee was. I don't think I've read an interview or read anything by anyone who said something negative about Renee. He seemed to be widely beloved, and my greatest regret is I never got to meet him. But I do feel like I got to know him over the course of meeting all his family and hundreds of hours of interviews.
John Morton just said it was a good restaurant. He ate there when he was doing Gumball Rally, when they were doing the scenes in New York, and he took all the movie guys to his restaurant.
Very nice. Very nice. Trying to think if we got anything else here, or we can kind of bring it to a close. Any final comments that you'd like to make about just, your portfolio of work? So Randy, you've got 2 car books, correct? Are you already starting to figure out what your next book's going to be?
I am, aren't we all?
Or but you can't say, or you don't want to give it away?
No, I'll tip it. I was really intrigued by how the Saudi royal family got involved in Formula One by way of TAG and Saudi Airlines on the Williams Formula One team. And this is only a few years removed from the 1973 oil embargo and the 1979 OPEC oil crisis. And in 2021, we've got the first Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. And so I think there's a similar, probably 3 or 4 part combined story there to explain how we get from those early sponsorship efforts to the 2021 event, with everything that goes along with Saudi Arabia. All of the intrigues, all of the human rights subjects. I think there's a lot of story there. So I'm tinkering with that.
Okay. Neal, what's next for you? Any car books in your future, or you got other topics?
I do not have another car book right now. I'm pretty far afield from cars. I'm writing about Gandhi's Salt March in 1930, which is his sort of first major nonviolent movement that overtook India. And it's an incredible story, but it's they're walking very slowly, so no fast cars.
Okay. Sylvia, working on another new novel, or what's next for you?
Yeah, I'm not doing a car book now. I'm back to being a Southern lady novelist.
Well, hopefully once we get through this COVID, Neal was supposed to come out and do a book signing at Auto Books right when COVID hit. I mean, that really blew your whole tour. You had no tour, I think.
No.
Randy, have you been out to Auto Books to do a signing?
I did go to Auto Books last November.
Okay.
Yeah, I really like Tina and Chuck there.
Yeah, I mean, that if you're in Southern California, for those who don't know, Auto Books in Burbank is pretty much the only place you can find pretty much anything written about a car or airplane. So it's Auto Books, Aero Books. So we always like to give them a little plug. It's a great place. You go on Saturday mornings, you usually bump into Jay Leno. He's there on a regular basis. Did he buy your book?
He bought Stardust. I don't know if he bought Caesars.
Okay.
No, I think he did. They
probably did.
Copy in his box for him.
I think my friend Pete Evanow was there signing his Z book, and Jay bought one and gets it signed. And so Pete, being a smart aleck, said, "And who should I make it out to?" So, well, anyway, thank you very much. Let me go back to the final screen share just so we can let people know about upcoming events for SAE SoCal. And thank you for everybody who joined us tonight.
See the pictures.
PJ, is that showing hopefully? This is an upcoming event. So March 10th, we'll have another more of a traditional SAE Tech Talk and some other events in March and April. So check for the newsletters, but support your authors, buy the books. I think at Auto Books, at least you can probably get signed copies. Neal, did you send out a stack of signed little plates?
I did. Yeah. I don't know if Tina's out of them yet, but I can always refill.
Okay. Randy, yours books are as well signed there?
Yes. Stardust.
Okay. And I know Sylvia's books are all there signed. And
this one will be there in mid-April, hopefully.
Okay. Mid-April, assuming they can get the paper, right? Hopefully we don't have supply.
We'll get somebody to work.
So, all right. Well, thank you very much. And thank you for tuning in. And for anyone who missed it, tell them they can watch a rerun on the SAE SoCal Zoom YouTube channel. So thank you and good night.
Thanks so much.
Good night.
Night.